Most considerations of biological communities that occur in different parts of the world but experience similar physical environments highlight convergence. And this is the case for tropical savannas. Oh, that's what I was saying. I was saying it's very pleasing to be in the wet tropics and to make the note that most of the tropical world is seasonal and is covered in savanna, tropical savannas. And so here's a map of the savanna world, and you've got some various rainfall things, and it's all, the rainfall's pretty well entirely during summer, and there's sort of between 3 and 6 months of no rain, which is why the trees are relatively small and sparse. But wherever you go in the savanna world, at least superficially, the savannas look the same. Sparse trees and lots of grass. But that's all can be a bit misleading, because the different savanna biomes of the world each have very different evolutionary histories. So they've come from different places to look like this. And even though they look superficially similar to the vegetation, the structure and biological composition is extremely different, as reflects their different evolutionary histories. And ants are really good at illustrating that, and I'm going to be talking about that. So here's an outline of what I'll be talking about. I'll be spending a lot of time talking about the Australian savanna ant fauna, which is dearest to my heart. And I'll be emphasising that it is an arid-adapted fauna. I'll talk a lot more about that. Then I'll talk a fair bit about the Brazilian or the neotropical savanna ant fauna, which is the most contrasting because it has a forest-derived fauna with almost no arid-adapted elements in it. I'll talk more about that. And this leads to not just contrasting species composition, because of course we're in different biogeographic realms, so the species are different, but contrasting functional composition, very contrasting, which leads to contrasting responses to environmental stress and disturbance that I'll be talking more about. And then I'll briefly talk about the African savanna ant fauna, which has elements of both. So Australia's arid origins of our savanna ant fauna. So the Australian savannas, 5 million years old, maybe, but they're the more recent part of a 20 million year history of aridification in the Australian continent, and many would be familiar with that. But it means because we're surrounded by sea, the only contact our savannas have had with any land is our arid zone. And so it's hardly surprising that that's where the ant faunas come from. Where else could it come from? And so the savanna ant fauna is functionally the same as the arid zone fauna. And I'll talk a lot more about what that means. Structurally and functionally the same. Compositionally slightly different. And so here's a picture. So for those of you who aren't sort of familiar with what we mean by the savanna zone, and I'll often refer to it as monsoonal Australia because it's influenced by the summer monsoon. The southern boundary is where the summer monsoon, that is the summer rainfall, no longer dominates the rainfall. And so you start getting winter rainfall and the further, so Alice Springs has got balanced rainfall when it gets rain. And as you move further south, it switches to winter dominated rainfall. So that's that southern boundary. And we're blessed in Australia, even though most Australians don't know this, we have the largest intact tropical savanna estate on Earth by a long way. We should be thrilled, feel special about that because it's incredibly important. And I haven't got time to go into this, but in many ways, the biodiversity of tropical savannas is equal and, or in some cases surpasses that of the high profile tropical rainforest cousins, and that hog all the attention that us savanna people like seeing. But anyway, so I'm just going to go through what I mean by the arid character of our tropical savanna ant fauna. This is one of the great biogeographic anomalies of the world, and it's one that's just not appreciated even by specialist ant folk, is the degree of diversity of our arid zone. In fact, inland Australia more generally is off the planet. Everywhere else on Earth, as you go from high rainfall to lower rainfall, the arid zone, ant diversity, like diversity of most things, drops off markedly. Not here. We have got an unbelievably, and you'll see what I mean by unbelievable, I can't even believe it myself, the diversity of ants in inland Australia. So I'm going to use the term arid to encompass semi-arid and seasonally arid in the broad sense. The issue is that the vast majority of species are undescribed, which means the rest of the world don't really know about it. It's undescribed, and I'll say more about this. And so I'll just give you an illustration about the unbelievable extent, the unbelievable megadiversity of undescribed ant species in arid Australia. So this is very little inconspicuous ant called Tetromorphium striolatum. Type specimen was in southern Australia, and we know that it actually represents a complex of multiple species. So that's not without doubt. The issue is, well, how many species are we talking about? And I'll give you an indication. So here I've been amassing a massive collection of Australian ants over the last 40 years. And so I've been able to, because they're all in the one place now, I've been able to look at these sort of issues. And so I've been barcoding thousands and thousands of DNA barcoding, thousands of specimens to help inform what's going on. So I'll be showing you some a gene tree in a moment for Tetromorphium striolatum, but I just want to sort of position yourself first. So this is a branch from the tree. I'll show you the bigger tree where this fits in a minute, but just a branch showing you some morphological variation amongst these species. So this is 9 species within this branch. None of them are described. And so I'm going to show you next where that branch fits in the bigger tree. There it is, see up there? So that little red box way up the top is that branch of 9 undescribed species, and gives you some idea of the extent of variation within that group. I mean, it's just phenomenal. And so monsoonal Australia have got all these arid-adapted elements in spades, and I'll just give you an example. So this is this Tetromorphium striolatum complex, and I'm showing CO1 tree. So CO1 is the gene that's most commonly used in ant studies to delimit species. And so I'm showing you some data from the top end, and then just south of that, the Sturt Plateau region of the central top end. And I've got a gene tree here showing that there are 50 species that we've sequenced from the top end, and from Sturt Plateau, there's another 50 species with 10 shared. So there's 90 species, just none of them described, just in those places of what we have collected and sequenced, not everything. So you sort of think, oh, I don't know, what does it mean for across the whole monsoonal zone? You think, oh my goodness, who knows how many hundreds or whatever of them. And then, so that's one genus. Thing about monsoonal Australia is it's got not just a huge diversity of these arid things that occur all through arid Australia, but they've also got these things that have a much more tropical distribution on top of it. Here's an example. One little tiny horrible species of monomorphium, known as one widespread species, 200 across monsoonal Australia, probably more than 300 across the whole country. Another genus, Meranopus ajax, is sort of species, likely 100 or more species across monsoonal Australia. Another genus, or this is another group of Tetromorphium spininodi, 100 species or more. You get the idea? So it's not just one sort of isolated case. It's a case across many, many genera and many groups of species within those genera. This just phenomenal, to say, sort of unbelievable diversity. And this is a broader context, because here's a recently published map of ant diversity in the world, global ant diversity, and look at monsoonal Australia. It's sort of got no, see what I mean? It's got no ant essentially, and that's because this isn't a map of global ant diversity, it's a map of global described ant diversity. And if you ignore monsoonal inland Australia more generally, I mean, it's pretty right. So the darker colours, bright reds, It's all about tropical rainforests. That's, you ask any ant ecologist, where's most diversity of ant? Tropical rainforests, of course, lowland tropical rainforests, and particularly in the Amazon, because there's probably 2,000 or more species of ants in the Amazon. Yeah, that's interesting. So how many ant species do I think are in monsoonal Australia? Well, here's this is when I first gave an estimate. This is 25 years ago, about this book, and in it, I put forward this outrageous estimate that there were 1,500 species in monsoonal Australia. Well, what? It's a savanna biome. That's nearly as many as the Amazon. You idiot, Andersen. What are you thinking of? You know. And so this is what we're looking at now. So here's a table, and here's some taxa on the left-hand side that I've been doing a lot of work putting together and barcoding, blah, 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 and published all the stuff. These are the number of the described species, which is sort of not many. The second column is my estimate back then with this outrageous total estimate of 1,500 species, nearly as many as in the Amazon. Can I believe it? Anyone believe it? No. And now, what appears to be the case in red, 1 or 2 orders of magnitude more than what I thought back in, so you think, well, how many does that mean? It means my estimate of 1,500 is just outrageously conservative. And so I had the delight last November of giving a paper in Manaus, Brazil, sent in the middle of the Amazon. The title is Move Over Amazonia, Monsoonal Australia as the Global Centre of Ant Diversity. One of my favourite moments. But it's still there's no big question. I mean, these figures are just ridiculous, and I don't believe them myself. But you know, if you scale up what we've done, there'd be 100,000 ant species in one world. It's not going to happen, but it means that there's many thousands. So that's what a map of global ant diversity should look like, with monsoonal Australia just standing out. So phenomenal diversity. It's also phenomenal abundance, just the sheer numbers of ants. And so, but those of you who travelled overseas will probably know this. Now, here in Australia, we expect everywhere there's ants everywhere, but that's not the case elsewhere in the world, including in arid zones and savannas. The trouble is, unlike species richness, there are very few records or very little robust data about how ant abundance here compares with ant abundance somewhere else, because there's just no standardized way of sampling to say, oh, you know, we all did this and I got this, blah, 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 blah. There's only one example where that's happened, and that's where I had a Brazilian student come out and repeat in the Darwin region what he had done in Brazilian savanna, exactly the same sampling protocols. And he came up with that ant abundance in Australia is 3 times. You know, it's just the sheer numbers of ants, 3 times as high as that in Brazilian savannas. And it's pretty high in Brazilian savannas, I can tell you now. It's not because of Brazilian savannas. So it's unbelievable abundance, but more particularly, this unparalleled abundance of these behaviourally dominant ants. So behaviourally dominant ants, I liken them to trees in plant communities. Trees are the dominant taxon. So like an ant, it's rooted in the soil and it uses foraging nodules, forage in the environment, bring back resources, just like ants do. And as a canopy tree can dominate the resources in a large area. That's what it does. So these behaviourally dominant ants can do a similar sorts of things. And so, but not only are they occurring in large colonies and have large foraging territories, but they're extremely aggressive and very fast moving, high tempo aggressive ants. And we have one particular genus called arid-adapted that hopefully, that's the quintessential Australian ant genus. I hope you all know that one. That does this most, but we also have many other related genera that do it. And their abundance is totally unparalleled anywhere else in the world, in any biome. And I often say to people, everywhere in Australia, right at this moment, outside of forest, so arid-adapted is arid-adapted, it has to have open spaces, it's not a rainforest. And there's other cousin, Ananika murmur, does the thing in rainforest. Has that open spaces. So every open space in Australia has at this moment a species of arid-adapted foraging on it. That's what I like to say. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but not so much, as I'll show you now. So here's some results where we address that issue of what extent of fine-scale coverage the species of arid-adapted have in terms of their foraging. So we put out these pitfall traps, which is a standard way of catching ants, every couple of metres, left them out for a couple of days. There's several plots just near Darwin, and I'll show you the results. And so the way these results look is each circle, and so this is a plot. Each circle represents the contents, the iridomyrmex contents of a pitfall trap over 2 days. When there's no circle, there was no iridomyrmex. And the abundance of iridomyrmex in the trap is scaled according to shading. You see all that? So just an open circle was just between 1 and 5, and black circle, bucket loads of them. You get the idea. And so there's 3 different functional types of iridomyrmex. Most of them little black jobs, so that's the middle one. But then there's a group that many of you might be familiar with, that are larger meat ant group, red, often coloured ones. And then there's a vast diversity of nocturnal pale ones. So they're the main 3 functional groups. And you can see that within each functional group, there's quite extensive coverage at the fine scale. And when you add them all up, iridomyrmex is total blanket iridomyrmex coverage of every square centimetre, not quite foraging at any particular time, but over a period, every square centimetre has got iridomyrmex foraging on it. And there's evidence from different sources that Australian ants have experienced high levels of behavioural dominance over evolutionary time, and that different taxa have got morphological, behavioural, and physiological and chemical responses. And I'm just going to talk about morphological and behavioural response. There's indicative of high competitive pressure, that is behavioural dominance and aggressive pressure, not resource competition, but interference competition pressure over evolutionary time. And here's one of my favourite genera, Maranopus, and it's characterised by having a big shield on the back. I'll show you more in a minute. And they've got deep grooves in the side of the head. And when they're foraging around, minding their own business, and a bully iridomyrmex comes up, they tuck their legs under the shield, tuck the antennae into the groove, and lie in a fetal position playing dead until the iridomyrmex wanders off. Here's the most extreme example. These are the turtle ants of the Maranopus testunitas group. Sorts of things from the Kimberley, only found the Kimberley, this group. Now, the interesting thing is that there are 2 other places in the world that have analogous morphology. It's analogous defensive morphology that's indicating a long evolutionary history in association with behaviourally dominant ants. Before I show it what these are, what is it drives the abundance of behaviourally dominant ants? There's 3 things. First one is temperature. And it's not just ambient temperature, it has to be direct solar radiation to get the thermal energy going. So it's that. The second one is combining the thermal energy with metabolic energy through honeydew, or at least nectar in some sort of form, sugary carbohydrate in some form. And the third one, to be a behaviourally dominant ant, you need a simple foraging surface so that you can easily monopolise things. Not in the complex leaf litter, you never get a behavioural dominant leaf litter, but a sort of flat foraging surface. So where in the world do you get those 3 things happening? I can see Susan having a little bit of a whatever. So Australian deserts, we've got an unbelievable supply of honeydew. That's another story. Where else in the world? It is the canopy of lowland tropical rainforests. So interestingly, from an ant perspective, the canopy of a lowland tropical rainforest is functionally similar to the ground in Australian deserts, and the ant communities are functionally similar. So if you go through the lowland tropical rainforests of the world. I'm afraid Australia doesn't have one of these, but in the New World, it's Cephalotes, fabulous genus of turtle ants, the major component of the arboreal fauna of near-tropical rainforests. And in the Old World tropics, it's Catullus. So Catullus goes all the way through Africa and comes down into Southeast Asia. Hasn't quite got to Australia at this stage. Yeah. Anyway, so that's sort of interesting convergence going on in terms of protective morphology in response, seems to me, in response to a long evolutionary history of association with behaviourally dominant ants. The next characteristic of the arid nature of Australian savannas is a high incidence of granivory. So in deserts, all deserts of the world, seeds are an incredibly important food resource. And one of the reasons is that they come in bursts of zillions of them, but they can be stored. And so that you can then have a buffer food resource in times of drought. And so every desert of the world's got lots of seed harvesting ants, and Australian savannas have just got unbelievable numbers of them, both in terms of species and density. So here's an example of a plot I've mapped out ant nests. So you can see how many harvester ants they are. Look at all the number of species, lots of them. No other savanna zone's got any of those. And as I'll say a little bit later, the neotropical savannas have got one harvester ant in the whole bio, one species. And the next trait is highly thermophilic. So thermophilic means high temperature, loves high temperature. And the idea here is that in deserts, savannas, middle of the day, very hot, very high temperatures, and for most ants, they cannot survive or certainly not forage under them because it's just too hot. So if you have special physiology that enables you to forage when it's really hot, you've got the world to yourself for a large part of the time. Not the idea? And in Australian savannas, they take it to the next level. Well, arid zone, Australian arid zone. So all deserts, arid zones of the world have one or two characteristic groups of species that do this. Nothing like we've got. So we've got this genus called Mellophorus. It's endemic to Australia. I reckon there's 2,000 or more species, and they many species, groups of them, and hundreds of species occur in our savannas. But here's some example of what I mean by that thermophilia. These are data I got from Kakadu National Park a long time ago, where you see this. So what this is a percentage of foraging abundance in relation to soil surface temperature, not ambient temperature, but soil surface temperature. And in blue is all ants species other than Mellophorus. And this is typical of ants. They like it warm, or they like it hot. In this case, around 30, 35 degrees is their maximum. But once it gets beyond 35 degrees, 40 degrees, they stop foraging. It's too hot. That's only when Mellophorus starts foraging. You can see that they peak at 50 to 55 degrees. And so they basically can forage during the middle of the day when nothing else is foraging. So if you're out in the desert somewhere, or even out here, middle of a hot day, and you see something running around, you can just say that. So that's your Australian savanna fauna. I think I've demonstrated that it's incredibly arid-adapted. Now I'm going to contrast it with the Brazilian fauna. So in contrast to Australia, which evolved in physical association with the deserts, Brazilian savannas evolved in physical association with rainforest, and it's younger than rainforest. And it's to the north and west is the Amazon, and to the east and south is the Atlantic forest. The Cerrado, their savannas in the middle, and their fauna, I call it forest associated, because all their main genera are forest genera. Whereas here in Australia, there's an incredible disjunction between the savanna fauna and the forest fauna at the genus level. And so the characteristic Australian arid genera like Mellophorus, like arid-adapted, you won't find a single one in the forest. Whereas here, all the savanna genera are basically forest genera that have spilled over to savanna over the last few million years. And this is well illustrated by looking at the relative incidence of arboreal species. So a high incidence of arboreal species is a feature of tropical rainforests. Virtually no other habitat in the world has a high incidence of specialist arboreal species. They're all ground nesting things, except for the savannas of Brazil. And here's some more data from that study of that student, that's Ricardo Campos, who repeated his Brazilian sampling in Australia and came up with these figures that his Brazilian samples, exactly the same sample, 48 specialist arboreal species in his Brazilian samples, 5 in the Australian samples. And that's sort of typical of what you get outside of rainforest, outside of the neotropics. And so if you go through the Australian scorecard of aridity, it's all these crosses. The only one that's not crossed is the phenomenal diversity, because at a plot scale, the Brazilian savanna ant fauna is very diverse. It's equal to Australian, 100 or more species per hectare, although they do have a arboreal component that we don't have. But the really interesting thing is, despite having this huge number of species per hectare, the best estimate for the entire Brazilian savanna fauna is 700 species. The savanna biome's huge, a vast volume. So there's just very little spatial turnover. And it's sort of interesting because many of these savanna species are also forest species. So it's not just from the same genes, but the same species in both. And so there's just very little turnover at the broader scale, which is why I've got a cross, because it's phenomenal, well, very high diversity at the plot scale, but not high at the regional biome scale. And all these other things associated with the Australian arid zone and fauna, nothing there. And this then becomes highlighted when you look at functional composition. And so if you look at the incidence of hot climate specialists, so these ants that love us when it's really hot, in the Australian savannas, we've got hundreds of them for many, many genera. Whereas in Brazil, one species, and this is their seed harvesting species I mentioned, the species of Ogonomyrmex. It's just unbelievably different. And the reverse, if you've got tropical climate specialists, things that really like it in the wet tropics, our savannas have just got a couple of things. The green tree ant, if you'll be familiar with it, gets out west as well as one of them. Whereas in Brazil, they've just got dozens of species, the dozens of genera and hundreds of species that would fall into that category. So functionally extremely different. And so given those functional differences, one can make a couple of predictions. One is a macroecological one. So for most taxa, we know that the number of species decreases with decreasing rainfall. Idea, that's typical. Australian savannas have got a great rainfall gradient. You go from the coast inland, it's a nice rainfall gradient going from nearly 2 metres on the Tiwi Islands down to about 500 millimetres mean annual rainfall the southern boundary. And so what you might think, though, that for Australian savannas, because the ant fauna is arid-adapted, that they won't show that typical decline in species richness, that there'll be high species richness all the way down, even down to 500 millimetres. And yes, that's the case. So here's some data showing that macroecological pattern, whether it's sandy or loamy soil. Our sampling richness is about 100 species per hectare wherever you are down that rainfall gradient. And in fact, our subsequent studies have shown that it's actually maximum species richness in the middle of the gradient. We get 150 million so species per hectare. But anyway, clearly there's not a trend of declining species richness in declining rainfall. But for Brazil, you think with a forest-associated fauna, they will be sensitive to rainfall. Forests don't like declining rainfall. And that's what you find, is that it's a complicated picture, but so this is the number of species in relation to rainfall in the warmest quarter. But you can see as rainfall increases or reverse rainfall decreases, there's a marked decrease in species richness for both arboreal and ground. And so what I've done is for the next one is sort of plotted those data on this Australian graph to show in the blue lines what you would get if you put the plot a very distinct decline in species richness in relation to rainfall. And that's just purely reflecting their different evolutionary histories and therefore functional composition of the fauna. And similarly, you might expect a different response to fire. So fire is a dominant process in tropical savannas everywhere. And what fire does, how fire affects ants and most other fauna, it's not the burning itself, but how it affects the habitat. This case, it's maintaining an open habitat, stopping forests from encroaching habitat. And if you're an arid-adapted beast, that's not going to cause you problems. You love it. You love open habitat, so you're going to have very high resilience to fire. As opposed to if you're a forest-adapted beast, you're not going to like fire so much and you have less resilience. At least that would be the prediction. So let's have a look at what data we have. So here's some data from a long-term fire experiment we've got going near Darwin. This is from a PhD student of mine, showing after 20 years the different species composition of burning every 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 5 years, no burning, and burning as hot as possible every 2 years. So a wide range of fire regimes over 20 years. And you can see there's strong overlap between all of them, not sort of distinct things, which is indicating very high resilience to fire. Yeah. The contrast is a similar experiment in Brazil, is just three different fire treatments over 8 years, every 2 years, 4 years, and unburned. And whether it's the trees or the ground, every community is totally distinct. There's no overlap between the communities of any of these fire regimes, indicating a much greater sensitivity to fire than Australia. And again, just reflecting the difference in evolutionary histories and functional composition. So the question is, how about Africa? We all love Africa because of that top picture, except they're not ants. What's the savanna ant fauna like in Africa? Well, the interesting thing is it has neither a really dominant arid-adapted component nor a dominant forest-associated. Got none of that. It's just got all these generalised things. So those of you who know their ants will be very familiar with their dominant genera, monomorph, Badoli, Petramorium, Chromatogaster. We're all familiar with them, but we've got those here, as in elsewhere, more than else in the world. But these are cosmopolitan genera, highly generalised, and this is what dominates their fauna. So I call it a highly generalised fauna. And if you go through this arid Australia checklist, they sort of got crosses against every single one of them. But interesting, and this is an interesting one. So here's some data from Kate Parr showing this curve. So I'll just lead you through it. So this is a curve looking at species richness in relation to the abundance of dominant ants. And it follows a hump pattern that many of you will be familiar with, this hump diversity pattern in relation to either disturbance or productivity. And the idea goes something like this. In very unfavourable conditions, you get few ant species and you get few behaviourally dominant, the abundance of behaviourally dominant ants is low. As the environmental conditions are more favourable, they both increase. Species richness increases, the abundance of dominant ants increases, up to a point where ant favourability continues to increase, the abundance of behaviourally dominant ants becomes so great that they start suppressing richness. And so you get this hump curve. Got the idea? So it's a classic hump curve. And so you'd think, well, this happens in Africa, where they've just got these generalised ants. What's going to happen in Australia, where we've sort of got these super dominant ants? What's that going to look like? Well, it looks like this, the bottom one. There's a positive relationship between the abundance of behaviourally dominant ants and species richness. You keep on getting more behaviour, and it's what's going on here. And I think what's going on here is this, is that what we are calling behaviourally dominant ants are different things. So in Africa, what they're calling dominant ants, these monomorphiums and Badolis, these generalised things, we call them subdominant ants. And they don't have proper dominant ants. And we've got these data, which indicates an interesting competition cascade where dominant ants have a negative influence. So we've got the data showing this, it's not just a hypothesis. Dominant ants have a negative influence on subdominant ants, which have a negative influence on subordinate ants. So the subdominant ants, by reducing the abundance of the dominant ants, by reducing the abundance of subdominant ants, protect the subordinate ants, which is where most species are, which can explain why in Africa, you took out the dominant ants, you just get that effect of the subdominant ants reducing diversity. Whereas in Australia, you're putting dominant ants, you have a positive relationship between the abundance of behaviourally dominant ants and species richness. In terms of increasing macroecological relationships between species richness and rainfall in Africa, because they don't have, the African fauna does not have a strongly thermophilic element, you would expect it to be declining with rainfall like most other things. And it does, that's the red line there in the data we have. And with fire, it's interesting though that they have, their response to fire in Africa is much more similar to Australia, a very high degree of resilience. So here's some species composition data from plots in Kruger National Park. Fabulous experiment been running for 50 years with zillions of different fire, 12 fire treatments, one of which is not burnt. Unburnt for 50 years stands out from the crowd, but all the rest, burning every 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, whatever, burning in spring, burning in September, whatever, doesn't matter. All very high degree of resilience. And I attribute that to the highly generalised nature of their ant block. So, just very broadly adapted things. So that's the message I want to give across, is that we have extremely contrasting biogeographic evolutionary origins of the fauna, which leads to contrasting functional composition and leads to contrasting community and macroecological dynamics of the faunas. And I just want to finish off, that's very nice. What are some land management implications of all this? And so I think there's a couple of them. One is this, is that it means that land use impacts, response to disturbance from one part of the world will not necessarily predict what happens in another part of the world. So we can't say, oh, well, in Africa they drought, therefore this is what's going to happen. You can't say that. You can't say it for ants, and I guess this is a message that we need to keep this in mind for any group, to be aware of past influence of past on present. So it means that, yeah, management interventions in one region are not necessarily going to work the same as that in another region. And then similarly, there's going to be differential, you might expect differential responses to global warming. Here in Australia, our arid-adapted savanna ant fauna loves it hot. It's going to be highly resilient to global warming, you would expect. Whereas all the Brazilian creatures fresh out of the forest, you would predict they're going to be much more sensitive to global warming. And that's
questions. Oh, there we go. So, Alan, I'll start with questions in the audience first and then open it up for online. Yes, audience. Paul.
Thanks. That was really super interesting. This sort of simple question, just excuse my ignorance, but out of the herbivores, is the invertebrates and ants in particular more important as herbivores than other invertebrate fauna in Africa, let's say? So, you know, it looks like there's more mammals as vertebrates in Africa. I don't know if that's true or not. And so is there a difference in herbivory that's driven by this difference in behaviour, etc.? Ants as herbivores, yeah.
We can't hear you at all. Sorry.
Thanks, Noel. I'll hand the microphone.
Can you hear me now?
I can, thank you.
Oh, good. So the question was about ant herbivory in the different savanna zones, and I was just saying that ants are not herbivores, other than the relatively small number of taxa that are specialist seed harvesters. But in terms of leaf-eating herbivory, no ants eat leaves. So the leaf-cutting ants that many of you will be familiar with, that are major, people call them herbivores, you know, that they take so much of the leaf biomass in the New World. They don't eat them, they grow fungus on them. And so, yeah, does that answer your question? And so that ants are not being herbivores themselves, they may play a role in regulating herbivory. And that's why I ask about the mammals, because there's a big story of ants nesting in acacias that ward off mega herbivores, giraffe and elephants, and they play a major role in the dynamics of those acacia trees. And, you know, maybe there's a role in terms of they might regulate. So it's grasshoppers would be the major invertebrate herbivores, and whether ants play any role in regulating grasshopper population, I wouldn't know. Hasn't been the work. I suspect not.
Thank you. So can I ask a question? Thank you very much, Alan. So it's about invasive ants. And so do you think that given that the arid zone is so diverse, do you think it's vulnerable to invasion?
Yeah, that's a good question. So not vulnerable, the reverse. And it's not so much the diversity issue, but it's the huge abundance of behaviourally dominant ants. So elsewhere in the world, these major invasive ants, big-headed ants, the fire ants, they have invaded natural ecosystems or natural and semi-natural ecosystems to a very large extent. With just a few exceptions, that has not occurred here. And so, for example, the Argentine ant has been in southern Australia for 100 years or more, and it's all over Melbourne, it's all over Perth and whatever else, but you'll never see it in natural habitats. Whereas if you go to western USA, it's sort of everywhere. And I would attribute that to our natural defence forces of arid-adapted and other behaviourally dominant ants. So the big exception is where arid-adapted doesn't occur, and that's in close forests. And so we have a good example in the Darwin region, where a local rainforest patch has been invaded by big-headed ants, African big-headed ants, that's caused a huge impact. And now you've got crazy ants in the forest here. There's crazy ants in forests on Christmas Island, and you've got Wasmania. And so there's a range of these more tropical foresty sort of things. So that'd be the issue to me. I'm actually not so much concerned about fire ants getting out into the bush, because they're not a forest thing. But yeah, so Laurie might like to say something more about this.
I was going to say, do you think the iridomyrmex could be a threat if it's introduced elsewhere in the world, given that it's a dominant ant?
I'd probably just add to that point to say what makes an invasive ant, or at least the ones we know about, are the ones that closely associate with humans, and so they're more likely to be spread around. And because humans that live in desert environments we don't think of them as being the ones traveling the world, as opposed to people who live in urban environments and so on. So it might just be more of a lack of opportunity for those kinds of ants to get transported around. And the invasive ants that we do know about are like the Argentine ant that you mentioned. They need water. So if you look at where they've spread in California, it's usually in association with either riparian areas or human associated irrigation or something like that. So I think that's another point. But I did have a question. And I did also just want to bring up with Paul, because you did touch on the ants in acacias. And so there's just been a big paper out that you might have seen where, so there's that ant acacia relationship there there's 4 different species of native ants that protect the trees from elephants and giraffes and so on. And they all have a different role and different niche on the tree. And so there is an invasive ant, Pheidole megacephala, that comes in, displaces those. And they've actually demonstrated that that ant species doesn't deter elephants and so on. So it's actually demonstrated that there's this whole cascade of relationships where because that ant doesn't protect the trees get knocked down more. And so it's actually changed how lions hunt in those areas because there's less coverage for their prey. So it's, you think of these little ants that maybe, you know, it's an ant, but, you know, ignore them at your peril. But I did have a question for Alan, going back to your data on richness and your phylogeography and you know, how many, when you do the metabar coding, that you come up with, you know, hundreds of species where we thought there was one. What do you think if all the ant fauna of the world, if we did that for all of it, would we stand out still? Or would it just be that, wow, not instead of the estimated 25,000 species, we're now looking at hundreds of thousands?
The answer to that is that that's actually been done in many places. So particularly Northern Europe and North America, the taxonomies, that's sort of done. There was a study looking at that in the Brazilian Atlantic forest. So the Atlantic forest is the bits to the east and the south, but in many ways is more diverse than the Amazon. And they asked that question: if we barcoded everything, how many extra species would be revealed? And the answer was about 6%. So, you know, not many. Having said that, I think that in other parts of the world, if the fauna were looked at more seriously, and particularly Africa, but also maybe Southeast Asia, New Guinea would be another one, you would get many, many more. But I think it's not just the barcoding. I've got to say, I've been saying this just based on morphology for a long, long time. And the great thing with the barcoding is it means that, well, you know, here's a bit of independent evidence. It's not just me saying this. Look at this. And so the problem is that when you've got a lot of undescribed species, unless they're vouchers of them all together in the one place, you've got no idea what the regional diversity is. Is my species genus split one the same as, you know, I don't know, because it's, you know what I mean? And so that's what I've been in a unique situation to be able to do, that over the last 40 years, I've basically commandeered every ant collection that people have had from everywhere and popped them together. That's my payment for identifying ants. Yep, I'll them up, but I keep them, you know, which means I've then been able to say that, oh, this one's actually the same or not from that part of the world. So the answer to your question is most places, no, I don't think so. Some places very much yes, Africa in particular. I think you'll find that the fauna at the local level is not high, but you know, I think if you looked at turnover, it'd be several-fold, at least more than what's currently recognised. As an example, there's a Tetramorium taxonomist. I don't know Paco. You know Paco Garcia? He specialises in this genus called Tetramorium, and Africa's a centre of diversity of them, and there would be, I don't know, 75 species or something named. He thinks there's at least 500, at least 500 or 600. Some idea, which is sort of thing I'm getting for many of these things. I will online. But my summary answer is Australia stands out, is a standout. So there might be some others with whatever, nothing like Australia. Yeah, so any online questions, and so the questions can be spoken, is that the idea? Yeah, so anyone online have any questions?
Yeah, hi Alan, it's Penny Van Aster here. Nice to see you.
Oh, Penny, how are you?
I'm good.
It's been a long time.
It has. I've got one word for you. Termites.
That's a good word.
Do they drive?
Do you want me to respond to that in some way? I can respond. I don't know.
Do they drive ant evolution in Australia, in arid Australia in particular at all?
Termites drive? No, I don't think so, Penny. You mean as a food source? A food
Yeah,
source?
I do.
Ants?
Yeah, I mean as a food source.
Yeah. Look, I don't think so. So unlike the lizards, I think where Penny's coming from is that the arid Australian reptile fauna is by far the most diverse, another amazing anomaly. And a lot of that seems to be related to specialization on termites. So I don't think that's the case for ants, Penny. I thought what you were getting at is that another biogeographic anomaly is the unbelievably low diversity of termites in the wet tropic rainforest. It's just so weird. Every other rainforest in the world, termites are just ballistic in terms of species richness. We've got a couple of species also. It's just crazy. Whereas you look in the arid zones, and this is where Penny's coming from, and even way down to the southwest, we've got lots and lots of termite species, which is bizarre.
Thank you.
Anyway, good to hear from you, Penny.
And Penny's co-conspirator, Noel Priest. How are you?
G'day, Noel.
I have a question.
Long-term Territorians, by the way. First Alice, and then.
And you inspired my love and awe of ants. They're just amazing. I had a follow-up question about the predatory dependent fauna that eat ants. It doesn't seem to be a dominant food source for most species of vertebrate fauna, maybe some spiders.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, that's a really another biogeographic anomaly. That so many of them, aren't there? And so it's interesting. Even though Australia's got this incredible abundance of ants, we have very few specialist mammalian ant eaters. So we've got lizards and some other invertebrates, but virtually no male mammalian ones. And so you look at the rest of the world. So Africa's just got chock-a-block full, unbelievable diversities, from aardvarks to hyenas that are specialists anteaters. And then, of course, in the New World, you've got those weird special, you know what I mean? Those weird giant anteaters and this whatever. We don't have any of that. And so that is a mystery. I can't explain it. We've got echidnas. Yeah, and so, yeah, right. So, and echidnas are everywhere, but, it's not as if they're dominating the landscape eating ants. So that is an interesting one, isn't it? No, I've got no explanation for why that might be the case.
Yeah, thank you.
Someone has said to me, "Oh, well, it's because marsupials can't do that or something." And what? Because numbats, they're specialist termite feeders. So there's nothing stopping a marsupial from being a specialist social insect feeder. And it's just you don't have one.
Can I ask a question, Sue? Hi, Alan. It's Lynn Schwarzkopf here. How are you?
Oh, g'day, Lynn. How are you?
I'm good. So I'm going to ask you a lizardy question because that's my background, of course. When they talked about I haven't kept up with the lizard, so I don't know what's happening. But it used to be that the lizard diversity, the termite diversity thing was like a diversion, and then they got stuck into age of the environment. And so the argument was that the difference in the different places, the different continents, was about the age of the arid zone. And you didn't mention that in relation to Australia, which is supposed to be oldest, right?
Yeah, so Australia is about 20 million years or something like that. I must admit, I don't really know the ages of some of the other arid zones. So, Lynn, I don't know if you've got those figures.
Yeah, the North American one is really, really recent. And the African one's sort of in between, I think. And it kind of matches the lizard diversity of the three places.
You said the African one's in between?
I think so, yeah. Is that right? Or is it the other way around?
Yeah, look, I'm not too sure.
Yeah.
But so yes, Australia's got a relatively ancient arid zone. The interesting thing, though, is at least for ants, is this massive speciation is not an ancient thing. So it doesn't go back 20 million years. So we're not talking about what's the genus level genusation. We're not talking about that. Mellophorus is the only genus that's an endemic genus. All these other megadiverse genera in other parts of the world, and the speciation is within similar, complexes of species. We're talking about something that's happened over the last few million years, not something that's happened over the past 20 million years. And also, interestingly, it encompasses both autochthonous Australian elements, that is, elements that have come with us from our Gondwana and our origins and are originally Australian. So things like Iridomyrmex mellifera, as well as things that have come to us. So, as we've been heading up towards the Southeast Asian plate, we've been swapping taxa. Most of the taxa I showed you, Monomorium and Tetramorium, Miranopolys, they've all come into Australia from Southeast Asia over, whatever relatively recent times. And so these are actually recent. This speciation is actually recent. So the extent to which that's related to, all what I've been talking about can be explained by the age of the arid zone. I'm not totally sure about that.
Okay, so what does it?
And I think with the lizards though, Lena, if you correct me if I'm wrong, it's a little bit of a different story. Is that the diversification is much deeper. It's not just within something like within Tenotus or whatever. It's a deeper level diversification, indicating something happened more like 10 or 15 million year old, older.
Yes,
is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess what I was wondering then, if it isn't the age, what does it? Like, why do they keep speciating so much as opposed to being like the Africans and just being generalists? What isolates them or makes them?
So I've got a theory. I don't believe it. And it goes something like this quickly. So if you want to know explaining species diversity, there's two components. One is history of extinctions, and the other is history of speciation. So extinctions, I think we all know that Australia didn't get covered in ice sheets during past glaciations, like particularly North America. So we didn't lose all the species. But I think it's got to be more than that. And one thing that I just learned relatively recently is we weren't covered in ice during those times, but were covered in sand. That apparently up to 90% of the continent was covered in sand. And you sort of think, well, that's interesting. What would that look like? And you think, it would look like most of the sand, but all the sort of higher elevation bits would be refuges, wouldn't it? And you can imagine there must be a lot of refuges everywhere. And so maybe that's it. And this happened repeatedly, Maybe that's it. You got the harsh sand environment, refuges, reproductive isolation, zillions of these refuges dotted through the landscape. And now they've all gone, they come together, and is that the explanation? So it's a nice story. The limiting problem with that story is that, well, that's not about ants. Everything should be everything, shouldn't it? And so that's the question. What evidence is there that other taxa have gone ballistic? We talk about reptiles, but just as we said, that's actually an earlier story. It's not that recent story. And so it's an interesting one. And I keep on thinking of the genus Acacia, which has about 1,000 Australian species, most in the arid. That's a lot of species. How did that happen? And I'm just wondering whether there are other invertebrate groups. So the invertebrate fauna of our arid zone is just so totally unknown. That's the problem. And are there other groups that are mega diverse as well that we just wouldn't know about? And I think there's one group, I think mutillid wasps, I've got a little bit of a fondness for. These are the velvet ants, because I do a lot of pitfall trapping, I get a lot of them, and I've got a vast collection of them, and there's unbelievable diversity. And I'm just wondering if you go through other groups, maybe you'll find a similar thing. I don't know.
Okay, thanks.
Has Matt got a question, or is that we? Yeah, so it could be interesting to see that, couldn't it? Yeah, I know, because Steve Morton if you come across Steve Morton, and he's got a fondness for these bush crickets in the arid zone, and he says a similar sort of thing.
Any more questions online? I'm sorry, I can't see you if you've got your hand up.
I can ask another question.
Okay, Lynn. All right, this is your last one.
This is my last question, I promise. I was wondering if it might have something to do, or if there's any possibility that it's driven by pathogens and antimicrobial peptides on the ants, if they, have different routes of getting away, escaping pathogens.
I have absolutely no idea, Lynn. I have never thought about pathogens as a driver of speciation. I've got no idea. Is that sort of a known issue for driving speciation?
I don't know. It's just that I know that
You might
there's
have
lots
come
of.
off something, a unique explanation for speciation, but
It's just that there's lots of antimicrobial peptide evolution in response to, serious pathogens. And so I could see how that might, drive species apart so that they look similar and their ecology is similar and everything about them is similar, but their antimicrobial peptides are different. And so they change a little bit. I was trying to think of a reason why you'd have a skrillion species that all look the same and have the same ecology, but are different species.
Yeah, right. Well, thanks for the suggestion. I get my initial response is that yes, pathogens have been important in driving the evolution of ants, but that's in the production of their metapleural gland, which is unique to ants, and virtually all ants have them. There are always exceptions, and they are full of microbial, antimicrobial chemicals, presumably related to their soil nesting life history. So there certainly is a pathogen component to ant evolution, but whether there's a role in speciation, I have never thought about it, but I'll think about it. Thanks, Lynn.
Okay, cheers.
All right, everyone, I think we'll call it. Thank you very much, Alan, for a really interesting seminar today. Would you please help me? Hope to see you back here again sometime.